Hello, my name is Rawranks, and once again, I'm here to provide suggestions and help with the donor searching process. For my second blog, I had to decide what to do next. The traditional answer would be to give information about how to do a search for a donor. However, I've already written a blog on that. I've written one, and I believe that everyone can figure it out. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. I will say to check out the blogs linked below. Hopefully something will show up down there by the time this is posted. And likewise, I will suggest that you use a known donor registry. I believe it is by far the best site out there for finding a known donor. It is completely free. In my experience, paid sites cost more. And I feel it is a little safer than some of the other options. However, I'm not going to go in much detail on the general process of searching for a donor. Instead, I'm going to jump straight into the first piece of information I don't yet have written in any of my blogs, but it's one of the ones I felt most strongly about, and that is the greatest risk when finding a known donor. Well, perhaps the second greatest risk. The greatest risk is that you don't screen donors at all, but hopefully anyone who's watching my blogs at all will screen their donors thoroughly. That's why these exist. But for those who are actually going to ask questions and are going to try to find a good donor, the greatest risk, very absurdly common, is actually two very closely related links of risks, which are projecting and tunnel visioning. So tunnel visioning is pretty much what you'd expect. It's very easy to become focused on one donor very early in the process. Most commonly, it's either the first donor that ever contacts you, or the first donor that ever contacts you that doesn't come across as blatantly creepy. Because unfortunately, you will be contacted by a few creepy donors at first. Please ignore them. You are at a much higher risk of running into creepy donors when you first log onto a site. Don't think that that's going to be the average donor. Just move on. You'll find some good donors soon enough. But it's very common to tunnel vision on the first non-creepy donor you meet, or the first donor at all that you meet, and to kind of put all of your eggs in one basket. Even women who say they're looking at other donors tend to spend a significantly higher percentage of time talking to that first donor they met, getting to know him, finding out about him, and then when it comes time to make a decision, they may very well say, I'm going to use this donor because I know him better. But the only reason they know him better is because they spent more time talking to him, because they'd already kind of focused on him. And instead of doing, they effectively have already made the decision, even if they haven't said that they made the decision. So one of the risks is simply tunnel visioning and not looking enough at other options, or even if you are looking at other options, not giving them the time to really prove themselves, or spending the majority of your time on one or two options. Very, very closely related to this is the risk of projecting on donors. This is so common I can't even begin to describe it. I know it's human nature. Even if you don't think you're doing it, there's a decent chance you're going to do it to some degree. Women want to love their donor. They want to believe he's a wonderful, amazing human being. They want to feel positive about him because he's going to be part of what their child's going to be, and you want to love your child. What's more, a lot of women want to get started with the donor process as soon as possible. They want to find a donor and say he's the one so they can start working on trying to conceive and having that child sooner. They don't want to take the time to screen further. Both of these are very reasonable thoughts, but the problem is this can lead to projecting, can lead to women seeing what they want to see in a donor rather than what's actually there. This can be a significant risk because it can lead to avoiding actual warning signs in a donor, or alternatively seeing things that don't even exist in the donor. And to give you an example, I'm going to give you a few examples of the worst examples of projecting I've seen. These are extreme examples. Most women don't go to this degree. I'll give you an example. Some of the women I've advised, I had one couple who was seriously considering a donor who, in his description of himself, had mentioned as proof that he liked helping others, that he got so upset with someone making fun of an individual for mental retardation that he broke the individual's arm. Nice that he's standing up for someone else, breaking someone's arm because of a joke, kind of a warning sign. Similarly, I've had a couple who told me that a donor was wonderful. They were committed to using him. They contacted me only for advice on how to do the shipping. But as I asked questions, they didn't seem to know answers. And as I tried to clarify what I had originally thought was misunderstandings, I and they continued to get more confused. So eventually I said that I knew they weren't coming to me for questions about that particular donor, but there's enough things that didn't add up. I asked them if they wanted to share their chat logs, conversations they'd have with the donor, see what I could read from it. And so they did. And after reading all of his posts, I did not know anything more about the donor. He had a tendency to jump between topics so rapidly that he never really finished a sentence, and therefore it is nearly impossible to read what he was saying. He was moving around too much, was too incoherent to understand and interpret his meaning. But if someone were to read it quickly, it's possible to presume that they couldn't follow him because he was just so smart. He was so far ahead that you just couldn't keep up. But really, he was just jumping around. And what I believe happened is she basically filled into those holes. All of those incomplete thoughts that he started writing, she read in her interpretation of the meaning, which was the thing she wanted to hear. And so she had convinced herself of all these wonderful details by hearing what she wanted in these very imprecise, ambiguous statements. But in truth, I reread the conversation 3 or 4 times and still knew almost nothing about the donor. And just to make sure it wasn't just me, I got permission to ask others. I had 2 other couples read the same information, and they agreed that they had very little knowledge of the donor after reading it. So what was happening is she was seeing what she wanted in ambiguous situations. So those are just 2 examples, but I've seen this everywhere, sometimes to far less of a degree than others. One of the most common examples, if I ask a couple why they're using a donor, the most common answer, and also the one that I give so little weight to, is that he seems to know a lot about donation and he's nice. These don't mean anything. First of all, a donor who has been donating for a year should know a little bit more about donation than the woman who just started looking a week ago. What's more, a lot of the donors who women have said know a lot about donation did not share anything all that insightful, or sometimes even shared wrong information. Until you know more about donating, you don't know if the information that your donor is sharing is truly insightful or even accurate, though most donors are accurate. The point is, every donor should be expected to know a little bit more than the one who just started this process a week ago. As to being nice, what does nice mean? Short of a donor cussing at you or abusing you, what does a donor have to do to not be seen as nice? As long as the donor is the least bit polite, the least bit considerate, he'll be seen as nice because the recipients want to see him as nice. And so everyone will say that their donor is nice. And so the point is, it is very easy to see what you want and to, because of this, stop asking questions. This is a concern because you can miss great donors. You might be selling for an adequate donor when there's an exceptional one that you just haven't spoken to yet. Occasionally, this can even lead to using truly questionable donors because a woman was so busy projecting what she wanted to see, she didn't actually get to know the true donor. And this is by far the most common mistake I see women making. So the next question is, how do you avoid it? How do you know if you're doing it? The answer to this is actually very simple. Talk to many donors. Talk to every donor. I suggest contacting every donor remotely local to you and shipping donors. The more donors you speak to, the better, for many reasons. First of all, that donor you just contacted might be better than all the last ones. You don't know. You might have an adequate donor, but someone 5 miles farther away is an exceptional donor. Until you've spoken to him and know, you always run the risk of missing a great donor. But the other advantage is it helps to give perspective. The more donors you speak to, the more you get a compare and contrast. The more you start to see certain things are standard for a donor and someone shouldn't get special credit for being knowledgeable about donating, because all your donors should be knowledgeable. The more you start to see different points of view, the more you get perspective, information you can use to better compare and contrast your donor options. It also helps to combat the tendency to project on a donor if you have seriously given multiple donors time to prove themselves. Likewise, it's not enough to simply talk to multiple donors. You need to give each donor time to truly prove themselves. You need to talk to those donors that have hope, because I'll admit, you'll speak to some donors and it'll be quite obvious they're not an option within the first conversation. It's fine if a donor is pressuring you to have sex or won't reveal his identity or any major warning signs, it's fine to just cross them out. But there should be a number of potential donors, and you should speak to each of those donors equally. Make sure that you don't focus the majority of your time on one particular donor. In particular, if you ever find yourself thinking, I want to use this donor because I know him better, you need to ask yourself, have you given the other donors a chance to prove themselves to you? But if you go in with this commitment to speak to multiple donors, this will help a lot. Another trick I do is to compete with your natural instincts. Most women naturally want to believe a donor is great. Their tendency is to give donors more credit. So when screening donors, I suggest going at it in reverse order. Instead of listing his pros, list his cons. Imagine your perfect idealized donor and list all the ways that this donor is not going to meet that. Now, no donor is going to meet your idealized donor. You want a great donor, but you're never going to have a perfect donor. Every donor is going to have health risks somewhere in his family. Every donor is not going to have exactly the personality you want. But if you list out the negatives, some donors will clearly have more negatives than others. And the main thing is that it forces you to identify potential negatives, because the tendency is to intentionally ignore those negatives. You want to know what they are so that you can compare and contrast them with other donor options. So to compete with your own natural tendency to elevate a donor to exceptional standard, it's good to make sure you are explicitly listing out the ways he does not meet your idealized vision, just so you know. That advice goes in reverse as well. I've met a minority of recipients who go the other way and distrust every donor, think every donor is out to get them, is not comfortable donoring with the donor option. In that case, I suggest actually listing out positives, because your natural inclination is to see the negatives. But for most women, the risk is that they are going to see too many positives. This is not to say that donors aren't great. As I've said, known donation is a wonderful option, but some donors are better than others, and you need some way to help give perspective so you don't just use the first donor you meet. Although sometimes the first donor you meet will be the best donor. So I believe that's the majority of my advice. Simply be aware of the tendency to project and do your best to give yourself perspective. Likewise, remember, other recipients will likewise project on donors. If a recipient says that they think one donor is great, make sure you find out if he's great yourself, because you can never be certain whether or not a recipient has projected somehow themselves. Keep that in mind, take your time, speak to many donors, make sure that you've actually compared and contrasted them all, and you will find a great donor because they are out there. You just need to make sure you hold out just long enough to know every option before you commit. Having said that, good luck with your hunt, and maybe I'll see you next time.